Right now, Michael Shermer talks free will on the Right to Reason podcast with Robert Stanley. I don't know a better way to ask the question than just to blatantly ask, do we have free will?
Absolutely we do, and I have no choice but to accept that belief.
That's not fair, Mike.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm a compatibilist. There's different positions on this. The three basic positions are libertarian free will, not political libertarian, but what philosophers call libertarian free will, where you absolutely have total free will. And almost no philosophers believe that. Then there's very few. Then there's, determinism, just, every last twitch and thought and itch and laugh and everything we do is determined in the same way that a billiard ball, careening around a table is determined. And then there's compatibilists, which hold that we do live in a determined universe where every effect has a cause and so on, all the way back to the Big Bang. But the choices we make that are part of the causal net are still our choices. So the part of the problem is there's no good way to work around this because of the limitations of language and cognition. So when a compatibilist says I make choices, this is what I would argue and I'm pretty much reflecting Dan Dennett's much more thought out position that he wrote in his book Freedom Evolves, that we have degrees of freedom. That is, let's say I have more degrees of freedom than a chimp. A chimp has more than my dog, the dog more than the rat more than the cockroach, and so on. It has to do with behavioral complexity and the number of options you have at any given point when you're, say, just walking along, go left, right, 2 degrees to the center or whatever. That there's more degrees of freedom for more complex organisms, and we're the most complex, so we have the most degrees of freedom. Now, all those things are still caused. There's still quantum effects and Newtonian mechanics at work and biology and genetics and all that. But still, the difference between, say, me and a drug addict has fewer degrees of freedom than I do because I'm not addicted to drugs. And so my behavioral repertoire is broader, wider. I have more choices I can make. And so in that sense, and also it's my brain, so it's me responsible for the choices I make because it's me making those choices, my brain, and the brain is a whole series of neural networks or modules. There's no self, but there's, part of my brain is overriding my impulses. Say I have an impulse to eat chocolate cake, but I have another part of my brain that says, no, Shermer, come on, you're trying to lose weight. Okay, all right. If I can get through the next hour and not have that chocolate cake, I'll be okay. And then I impose certain things I've learned in my life to control my behavior so I don't eat the chocolate cake. And so I can override my impulses. This is called free won't. And so there I think there's reasonable arguments to be made for compatibilism. And in any case, we feel like we have free will. We're very hypocritical about this. You feel like you have free will, but that I don't. And you treat me as if I'm a deterministic agent in the world, and I do the same thing. I feel like I'm free, but I treat other people in the world as if it's determined, and we all do this. So this is what the philosopher Hans Weiner called a useful fiction. It's a useful fiction to just assume we have free will because it feels like it. We are making choices, real choices, that you can override in the world. And in any case, to have a civil society, we need to hold people accountable. And finally, I think psychology and law have merged pretty well on these issues of allocating punishment in a Skinnerian behavioral adjustment way, that we're trying to get people to change their behavior in a kind of a game matrix. Like, let's say we're going to allocate certain punishments for certain behaviors. So like we have first degree murder, second degree murder, and so on. We make distinctions for people in crimes of passion or crimes of rage versus plotted out and intentional murder. Or say, the guy had a brain tumor, and so he couldn't control his rage, or that there's certain people with brain damage, like Adrian Rain's book, The Anatomy of Violence. And I think that's what it's called, The Anatomy of Violence. He's the guy that scanned the brains of serial killers and found out that their prefrontal cortex is pretty shut down, pretty quiescent, largely non-functioning. So everybody has impulses that bubble up from underneath. And now most of us don't have impulses to just walk around killing people. But these people that when you look at their backgrounds, they have horrible backgrounds, and they've been, banged on the head, they have brain damage and so on, and the equivalent of a tumor, their prefrontal cortex that controls their urges is just not working. So don't let these people out, for God's sakes, but treat them in a way that it's more of a mechanical problem. Well, you and I don't have that problem. Our prefrontal cortex works pretty well, so you and I should be held accountable for not controlling our impulses as opposed to somebody else who can't control them. Still, don't let them out, lock them up, because we don't want them to cause mayhem to society. But instead of punishing them in a way like a theological system of issuing punishments for sin, we should treat them as it's a behavioral problem that needs to be solved. So that's my take on that.
You said so much there, and I have no doubt that the listeners, even before I'm talking now, have already hit rewind to play a lot of that back, because that was a lot of information really fast, and I'm gonna have to join them in that. I got to play a lot of that back myself later. On my end, I got focused on one thing that you just said, and I was hoping you could clarify. Did you just say there is no self?
Yeah, well, this is actually a big subject in both philosophy and now cognitive science, that the brain consists of a whole bunch of modules or neural networks, whatever metaphor you want to use, that evolved to solve certain problems. And it's not clear where the self is. We feel like a self. It may be something of an illusion, but it's a really good illusion if it is, because it certainly feels like I'm a self contained in a single body. I don't go so far as some people. Bruce Hood wrote a book, I think it was called The Illusion of the Self, in which he made this argument. And that's the argument. I don't go that far, but there's the idea that, like, where would free will be located? Well, it's not located in any one place. Well, where's the self? There is no self module in the brain. It's probably just the coordination of all neural networks at once. Michael Gazzaniga, the neuroscientist here at UC Santa Barbara, I'm up in Santa Barbara now, he talks about the left hemisphere interpreter. That is, there's a portion of your brain, your left cortex, that coordinates all the others into kind of a coherent narrative story that makes sense, even though it's mostly just random firings and the brain's just doing whatever it's doing. But there's a part of your brain that coordinates it all to make sense. And so this is why we spin doctor things after the fact, the hindsight bias, for example. It's like, oh, that makes perfect sense the way it happened. Well, it really didn't. And you're just kind of spin doctoring a story so it's not just chaos out there. Right. But it could be the self is something like that. Something like a narrative storyteller that coordinates all the impulses that come into your brain and your thoughts that you have into some coherent story that isn't really real. That's the argument.
That was the equivalent of me asking you, Dr. Shermer, who am I?
Yeah.
Who am I?
Yeah.
It feels like there is someone, and this is probably the worst way to characterize it possible, but it feels like there is someone behind my eyes viewing reality. I mean, would that be a fair description?
Yeah. That's absolutely, and it's true. Now, of course, it's a species-specific perceptual system that is, the famous story, what's it like to be a bat? The only way to find out would be to, plug in some sonar systems into your sensory apparatus and start pinging objects with sound and so on. Well, you still wouldn't know what it's like to be a bat unless you were actually a bat, in which case you wouldn't be asking the question. So it isn't actually possible to know. But for the most part, I think if we pull back and look at the bigger picture, when you're standing there in front of the mirror, yeah, it is you. There is a you there. Even if it's species specific and it's in reality isn't really real in the sense that every species sees a table or a chair or another person differently than you do. There's still something out there that really exists. We don't want to go so far as to be solipsists and say there is no reality. But on the other hand, it's good to be humble before the universe in that sense that, we have to be cautious about what we believe because it's easy to be fooled. Again, this TED Talk that I just watched yesterday, this Anil Seth, he has really good examples, sort of like I do in my TED Talks, of how optical illusions. He has a really great audio illusion similar to my Stairway to Heaven played backwards thing, where he plays this audio clip, you have no idea what it is. Then he tells you what it says, then he plays it back again, and you can hear the words perfectly. And it's like, oh, that's really cool. And that's an example of why we should be humble before the universe, modest in our conclusions, careful not to be too overly confident in our beliefs, because it is so easy to be fooled.
Music brought to you by aloststateofmind.com, and find more episodes like this at therighttoreason.com.